Hello, everybody, and welcome to What's the Story podcast, WTS 274. My name's Danny Murray.
I'm Graham Merrigan. I was right in the 274. I love it.
You were right, yeah. And this week, we're welcoming back an old friend. At this point, he's not a friend, he's a family member. And it's great to see him once again. The wonderful, the beautiful, the intelligent, the clever, the stunning, the magnificent Philip O'Connor.
The Bowes Tramp.
I thought, hang on a second, there's somebody else on as well that I didn't know about. That intro, I don't recognise myself at all, Dan. But then, as we were saying off air there, I don't recognise you either. Jesus, you're looking brilliant. Yeah, Mero looks like he's been out telling people how to park their cars outside the Olympia Theatre. He has a woolly hat on there this evening, despite being indoors. So we won't go into that.
It's cold. It was cold out when I was walking the dog.
Well, that's the thing, though. I saw many lights on in here. It looks like fucking Switzer's window at Christmas. My missus will kill me now because the electricity bills later on. But anything, because I know a lot of people are listening to this, but we're actually looking at each other doing this, you know. So I have to be a little bit in the light anyway, you know. So great to be back, as always.
I had to purchase a ring light because the overhead light is shit in here. So I purchased a ring light.
What's a ring light?
I didn't like where that was going, Mero.
For reference, it's not a light that you shine.
What were you looking for?
It's not a light that you shine out your hoop. It is. It's one of those. It's a. I believe.
Oh, it's an influencer light, is it?
I was going to say makeup and influencers. That's where you get that. And Cubes made the recommendation. She was like, "Why don't you get one of them to cost a tenner?" I was like, "John's not a bad show." And yeah, it's doing the job.
What do you get it for?
Well, for stuff like this, and then for work when I have to be on camera for work-related matters.
Oh, very good.
The pandemic, I'll tell you, there's some lab at a factory in China after the pandemic has made a fortune out of ring lights and stands and USB microphones. But the one thing, and if we can beg the good listeners, the great sound people that listen to this show week in, week out, this award-winning podcast, stop with the poxy backgrounds, lads, right? We know you're not sitting in Southern California, right? We know you're sitting in Ballybrack, and it fucking doesn't look like that, you know. And it drives me mad, you know, these lovely sort of interior designed houses. I know your washing up is just out of the picture, lads. Let it go. I'm not judging you here, you know, but please get rid of those. And you know, the blurry edges around their head. Oh, Jesus, no, never again.
We're definitely judging Phil.
I am judging. If they do use them, I'm judging them definitely. If there's a pile of washing up in the background, that's grand. I mean, Mero, I can see that you have a pile of coffee cups there in the background and porn mags and a whole lot. Like, and I'm not judging. That's like, you know, you do you.
I will, always.
Is that the Shawn Michaels edition of Playgirl, Graham? Is it?
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. Phil, how have you been, my friend? It's been a couple of months, it's been a minute and whatnot, and the world is a madder place than it was when we last talked to you. So how's life for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, Danny. I always love it when I get the text message from yourself, or in this case from Graham, going, "Oh, do you want to come on the podcast again?" Because the answer is always yes. And then you always think, "Well, geez, what are we going to talk about?" Because it's not even at the stage now where Danny sends me a WhatsApp and says, "Oh, we're going to talk about this." You know, they just wind me up and let me off. It's been mad, like, you know. So over the summer there, I did the usual thing of, like, you know, around about Christmas time, in the days after Christmas, we get together as a family and we decide that we don't like each other enough to go on holidays. And then I go and find something, and you know, to do for myself. And then all of a sudden you get a call when you're in England at the women's Euros, you know, wandering around Brighton and Southampton. Oh, by the way, we're going to Greece. Make sure you feed the rabbit when you get back. You know, that kind of thing. You know? So I did that, and then, you know, things have opened up again. You know, I'm always wary of this thing of saying, you know, the pandemic's not over. I'm sure, you know, we talked about you know, comorbidities and things that people have. You know, we still have to be careful. There's still an awful lot of people at risk, but that said, you know, we're treating life as if it's over. So, you know, I was in Las Vegas there recently for the UFC fight. Nate Diaz's last fight in the UFC. Khamzat Chimaev, the Swedish guy, was fighting on that card. So I said I'd go over and do a little bit of work there, you know. And, you know, what I cannot understand is how he can miss weight by 7.5 pounds when Danny can drop 40 kilos in a couple of months. It's like, that's what's happening here. So I'm going to say,
what is the story there, though, Phil? That's nonsense.
I think that was one of those things there that, you know, so for people who don't follow the UFC, Khamzat was fighting at 170 pounds. So the weigh-in is the day before the event. And for non-title fights, you have a 1 pound limit. So he could have weighed in at 171, right? Now, the advantage is that the lower the weight class you can come down to, the bigger you're going to be, right? So when Conor McGregor was fighting at 145, he was always what's considered a big 145er. His natural weight is probably 155 for fighting. I'm doing kind of the same thing myself. I might compete again next year in jiu-jitsu. So I'm trying to get down to 88.3 kilos. Below that, I'm currently at about 92. And, you know, if I can as long as I don't gnaw the padlock off the fridge door, I'll probably get there, you know. But the thing about when you're weight cutting or cutting weight for sport, it's like it has to be a very managed process. And a lot of it is to do with timing and it's to do with discipline. So fellas who are getting up on the scales before a boxing match or a UFC fight, often the way they will lose the weight is they literally drive all the water out of their bodies, right? So they'll dehydrate themselves entirely and then they'll get up on the scales and they'll be ready to tip over most of the time. I'm sure you've seen people standing on the scales looking awful. And then after that, there's a managed process again of rehydrating and more nutrition, that kind of thing. And I think basically what happened was the Khamzat started too late, because if you go into a severe weight cut like that, if you severely dehydrate yourself, after a while your body just goes, hang on a second, pal, this is not a good idea, right? So I'm not doing this anymore. And it doesn't matter what you do, your body just goes, no, I'm not doing that. I'm just going to pass out in the sauna. I'm not going to sweat anymore. I'm done, you know? And I think that was what happened to Khamzat, because he cramped up, which is usually a sign that there's no water left in the body and that, but it's also the body telling you, look, pal, you need to get water on board here, you know? So he came in 7.5 pounds over, and that caused chaos on the card, but it caused a good kind of chaos, because it was kind of, things were rambling along. He was supposed to meet Nate Diaz. He probably would have thumped the lard out Nate Diaz, wouldn't have been any crack, but it reworked 3 fights on the main event, on the main card, and it turned out to be a brilliant weekend, and all that controversy and everything else like that, you know? Now, I don't know if he'll ever be allowed to fight at 170 again. I think he can make the weight. He just has to manage that process just a little bit better, you know.
He's the fighter that pontificates the Chechen leader, isn't he?
Khamzat is, yeah. So he'd be a favorite of the Chechen president, a guy called Ramadan Kadyrov, or Ramazan Kadyrov, I think his name is. And you know, this is a real complicated one. So, you know, when I was going over there and I was talking to Swedish media outlets saying, okay, I'm going to be in Vegas for the Khamzat fight, right? Nobody gives a shit about Khamzat fighting. All they cared about is his opinion on Putin and his relationship to Kadyrov, right? And that's great. I understand why that's a big thing, right? We remember Conor McGregor, I think in 2018 at the World Cup, took a picture with Vladimir Putin, talked about him as a great leader, et cetera, right? Now, the difference between Conor and Khamzat is Khamzat doesn't talk about this, right? And I've asked him before, and he just shakes his head at me. Like, and no, this is without microphones or cameras or anything else like that. And I've asked him I've basically asked him, do you feel like talking to me about this? And he shakes his head, right? You're essentially talking about a dictator, right? And he has attached himself to Khamzat rather than the other way round, right? So it's kind of like boiling the flog. I think Khamzat at the beginning, when he was getting a sort of a limo ride in from the airport to meet the president, he thought this was cool. But then all of a sudden, you know, Kadyrov expects things of him. And I don't actually know if Khamzat is in a position where he can say no to Kadyrov now, right? You know, it'd be like one of the famous cross-country skiers or a famous Russian ice hockey player saying no to Putin. And it's not what will happen to them. Oh, they'll probably be back playing in the NHL or competing in cross-country skiing. So what happens to their family? What happens to their father and their uncles and that kind of thing? And I think without Khamzat ever having said this to me, I do think that that's what the fear is there, as it often tends to be when people are sort of, you know, held up as an example or, you know, essentially used in sports washing in this case, you know, and I don't think he has a whole lot of choice. And the unfortunate thing is that when the Swedish outlets ask me, he doesn't talk to a lot of them because he knows they're going to ask these questions, right? And he doesn't want to lie to people. He doesn't want to say to people, you know, oh, he's a great bloke, or, you know, no, you know, he doesn't want to tell the truth either. So he just says nothing. And I think that that's a little bit sad in a way, because if we zoom out a little bit now and we talk about the World Cup in Qatar and we talked about it with the Beijing Olympics in China and everything else like that, I have a hard time, you know, looking at Manchester City and saying that Erling Haaland needs to come out on the side of human rights and everything else like that, because the young fella's not very clever. And there's not a whole lot that he can say in his position in any diplomatic way that's going to make any difference to that situation. So it's actually better that he says nothing, you know? So, I mean, I wasn't able to do the work that I wanted to do with Khamzat. I'd love to sit down and be able to tell that story and to see how that sort of affects him personally. But I think if that's going to happen, it's going to be long after Kadyrov is in the grave and that dictatorship has fallen, because I don't think at certain times it's not possible to get the story about somebody, you know, what certain people are still alive. So it was a bit sad. And it's kind of sad as well that the guy is... Now he has two negative things, right? He has the Kadyrov connection and he has that weight cut miss as well, right? So now he's the heel. Now he's the bad guy in the UFC. That almost suits him because he's not expected to go out there and be nice to anybody. He can let all that drop and just be a complete bastard if he wants to. Yeah. And that suits him an awful lot better. A little like the Colby Covington thing, a little bit like Mike Tyson was in the day. Mike Tyson never had to pretend that he was a nice guy. He just went out there, smashed people, did his thing, you know? So I think that actually suits him, you know, but it's on the surface, it looks like a really simple thing. Oh, you're hanging around with a dictator. You need to distance yourself from that guy. But like everything else under the hood, it's an awful lot more complex than that.
You've touched on about 15 things there that I want to ask you about, Phil. So I'm going to try and
like Phil always does. You're kind of like we don't have a pen and paper, and you're trying to think of segues here. Like Danny had 15, I'd about 6.
It was
mile a minute.
You let Phil talk for 4 minutes, you get 4 months of material. It's beautiful. I love it.
This is why I'm on the podcast. My face should be on the logo now as well at this stage.
Yeah. Right. So you mentioned there about kind of like, you mentioned sport washing. I want to come back to that, but I'm just going to push it one side for 1 second, right? You mentioned Erling Haaland, or you said it a lot more beautifully than I did. And the expectation maybe that's placed upon sports stars these days to speak out when, don't get me wrong, it's great when you see them speaking out. And it's great when they do take a little bit of a social conscience and say, I'm going to put my hand up and say, I don't think this is right, and here's why.
They've no obligation to do so, though.
But this is it. I think there's maybe an expectation, maybe there's a little bit kind of, we all look at Muhammad Ali and we all think he was the greatest, and, you know, he picked his moments and he said his, and everybody remembers it. It's brilliant and beautiful. But it's not always as clear-cut and as always as simple as that. And in this instance, when you've got a dictator who maybe is, you know, cozying up to you when you're not too comfortable with it, but you're equally aware of the dynamics of how things work in a certain country, and you have family members there, and you're kind of like, best thing I can do is keep my mouth shut and disappoint a lot of people over in the West or whatever, who say, you should be speaking up, you should be doing this, you know? Like, are we expecting too much of sports stars in this day and age?
I think we are, Dan, because by the time it gets to, you know, Kadyrov putting out a picture with Chimaev, or, you know, Erling Haaland won't be playing at the World Cup now because Norway didn't make it, you know. But if we're expecting, you know, Alexander Mitrovic from Serbia to speak out about these things, it's like, hold on a second. This was nothing to do with him, right? He didn't choose. You know, he wasn't he didn't vote for this or anything else like that. He's a footballer with a very, very limited career, right? The biathlete Sebastian Samuelsson, who I've had discussions about politics with, you know, and, you know, because he's trained a lot and he's competed in Russia, he's talked about doping, you know, he's really come in for an awful lot of grief, right? And then I was talking to him about competing at the Olympics in Beijing, right? His career is limited, right? You're probably talking about at the top level of biathlon, 3, max 4 Olympics, right? Unless you're, you know, beyond all and this fucking great Norwegian who seem to go on forever, right? But why should they have to be the ones to boycott, or why should they have to be the ones to speak out when Nike won't do it, Budweiser won't do it, Ireland won't do it, Denmark won't do it? You know, why is this on them, right? So we're also asking people, I've maintained for a long time in Nordic media in general, and people sort of, you know, took a step back when I said it the first time. It's like, stop asking Haaland questions about Manchester City and about that kind of thing, because he actually doesn't have anything I want to hear. He's not going to progress the thing. You know, he's a young flip, right? He's what, 21, 22 years of age. He's a whole heap of money and not a single opinion that I have any interest in whatsoever, right? Now, there's a big difference between him and Tim Sparrow, the former Finnish captain, who I texted him today because I want to talk to him about these things. Tim is somebody who thinks deeply about these things. The reason I came into contact with him was several years ago when Qatar was awarded the World Cup. It could have been the first World Cup that Finland made it to. How would he be about that? Certain players already said they were boycotting the national team over that, right? He's somebody you can talk to over it. So my point on that would be, and then the other thing is that if you have to speak up about one thing, if you decide to speak up about one thing, well, then you have to speak up about everything. No, we cannot place those demands on people, right? So LeBron James comes out and wears a t-shirt, I think it was in memory of Eric Garner, saying, I can't breathe, right? That doesn't behoove him then to come out when every black person or person of color is shot dead by the cops in the United States. He doesn't have to do the same thing for everybody, right? He is more than entitled to pick and choose and to have an opinion on things, and also to not have an opinion on things, right? And what you avoid there is this sense of whataboutery, right? People will always come at me going, what about it? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this fucking specific thing here, right? Now, you can work out what I think about things from most of the things that I say, but at times, we'll probably talk about it a little bit later on, right? The whole Russia thing is a mess, right? I disagree entirely with the invasion of Ukraine. It's an absolute disaster, and everything begins and ends there. You got to pull back, lads. This was a mistake, right? I understand why it happened in the same way that I understand why the IRA did the things that they did in Northern Ireland. I am neither condoning nor excusing either of those two things. I understand. Understanding is not the same as condoning it, right? But if we get back to the athletes, we're talking about often relatively young people with very little experience who have dedicated themselves from the time they were 8 or 9 or 10 years of age to being the absolute best in the world at one thing, right? They're not writing War and Peace, right? They're not reading Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky, right? That's not who these people are. And we have to have the correct expectations of them. Now, you can walk into, you know, the FAI headquarters in Abbottstown and you can ask hard questions of everybody in there who's involved in the process. Where did our votes go? Where do our money go? Absolutely. That's their fucking job, right? But it is absolutely not the job of, Seamus Coleman or of Harry Kane or of Erling Haaland to go and explain these geopolitical things to me. And frankly, I don't want them to do it. If a player decides to boycott that, I will absolutely support them in that. But again, that's up to every single one. And we can't demand that they do these things. That's just too much of an ask for young people.
So Phil, in regards to Eddie Howe's appointment as Newcastle United manager, and it was brought up on more than one occasion at his press conferences. Are you aware of who your owners are, this, that, and the other? Do you think that was inappropriate, or do you think why do we care what Eddie Howe thinks of Saudi Arabia?
I think that the question always has to be asked, Graham, right? So if I can ask Jim a question, I don't ask a question if I know I'm not going to get an answer, right? It's just, to me, it's pointless, right? To use that horrible term, it's a virtue signal. Me sticking up my hand to talk to Dana White about things I don't care about. I'm not going to do that, right? Eddie Howe was different because he's a grown-ass man who has seen a bit of the world and is doing this for the money, right? He is not in this because, it's furthering his career. He was doing really, really well, and he would have continued to do well without ever going to Newcastle United. The same cannot be said of Alexander Isak, who's now Newcastle United's record signing and came from, basically over there, right? Alexander's, I've known him since he was 16, 17. He played for AIK here in Stockholm, signed for the club for, I think it was about 70 million euros. And, again, another young player, if you were to ask him about that, what the fuck does he know about Saudi Arabia? What does he know about the death of Khashoggi? What does he know about the whole thing of Mohammed bin Salman, this is going to be a better country. We're modernizers, but we're taking our time. He doesn't know anything about these things. But it is absolutely fair to ask that of Eddie Howe, because Eddie Howe was management, right? So if we want to go back old school, the 1912 lockout, 1913 lockout, we can say that there's a difference to me between the workers, which the players and the athletes are in this case, and the managers, which the FAI and Eddie Howe are in this case, right? Now, Eddie Howe is never going to give you a satisfactory answer. I would have hoped that the best you can hope for in that situation is for somebody like Eddie Howe, who, they've entrusted with a job, for Eddie Howe to come out and say, look, we have heard these things about issues around Saudi Arabia's record coming in terms of human rights and that kind of thing. I am hoping that we can do all we can to work with them to help them to understand why these concerns exist, right? Now, that's straight out of the car communications.
Nip it in the bud straight away, Phil.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, if you come out and you deal with that, what more can you ask of Eddie Howe then? Eddie Howe can say, I'm working behind the scenes. I'm trying to help people understand that. That's all I can do in this position. I'm also, admit to it, Graham, I'm also an ambitious man. I want to do great things with this football club, with these people. These owners have come in now. I'm not the one who decided it. If the Premier League doesn't want these people in there, if they're not fit and proper owners, as the terminology is, then fuck them. Don't let them in. They've been let in. That's above Eddie Howe's pay grade, right? But I do expect something to be a little stronger from the Olympic Committee, the Irish Wheelchair Association, when it comes to sports, when it comes to the FAI, when it comes to whoever else, right? They need to be the ones to be taking a stand, right? And one of the interesting things ahead of this World Cup, lads, has been the Nordic football associations have come together and they've had a sort of a united front, right? And that's because you have strong player unions here under FIFPro, the Global Player Union, and they got together to talk about these issues of migrant workers. Now, I think they were sort of used a little bit in their own way for sports washing, but the new president of the Norwegian Football Federation is a woman named Lisa Klaveness, right? I'm annoyed with Lisa at the moment because she hasn't texted me back. I wanted to talk to her last week, actually ahead of this conversation. It would have been great to share what she had to say. Lisa's a gay woman with 3 children, and she got up in front of people in Qatar and she said, we need to do something about this, right? I, as a gay woman, need to be able to come here and know that I'm not under threat, that I'm not under threat of imprisonment. And you know what? Not only that, the gay people living here, and they exist, need to be able to live here in safety and security. Now, what do we need to do as a sport, as governing bodies, as a huge global event that the World Cup is, to ensure that that happens? Because if there's going to be anything out of this, lads, it will be that sense of progress. For the most part, it never happens, right? After the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Sochi in 2014, I think it was, the next thing that happened was the annexation of parts of Ukraine started, right? That was what sports washing was used for there. Same thing after the Beijing Olympics, the crackdown on the Uyghurs started there. So, they buy the credit and then all of a sudden they use up that credit in repressing other people, right? But we always have a chance to break that cycle. And we need to do that now with Qatar. We need to say to the people in the Middle East, and we need to say to these regimes in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like Kuwait, like any place that has these kinds of laws, yes, you are welcome, but You have to make everybody welcome.
So,
Everybody has to be part of this. There's certain values that we all have to share if we're going to progress along this road together.
So this thing with sport washing then, right? And we're seeing it more and more. And the term sports washing, people are going to hear it a lot more between now and the end of the World Cup later this year. And we've seen it in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Let's stick with those examples, because Qatar obviously hosting the World Cup, and the controversy around them hosting the World Cup is plain to see, and everybody gets it. And this whole thing of like, it's the money. Saudi Arabia, the same. If you look at what Saudi Arabia have done, they've enticed massive global brands like WWE over, and WWE hosts a big, huge pay-per-view event every single year now. I think it's a Crown Jewel. Is that what it's called now?
Crown Jewel, yeah.
Crown Jewel.
Can I just comment on that for a sec?
Yeah.
Just in regards to the WWE, they signed a 10-year contract with the Saudi Arabian government, and it's definitely one pay-per-view a year. But at one time, I think the Greatest Royal Rumble and the Crown Jewel, I think there might have been 2, but say there's been 6 since the start of their contract with the Saudi Arabian government. The first few pay-per-views, there was no women allowed on the card.
That's right.
And the most recent pay-per-view, women were allowed to perform. So is that progress?
Yes and no, Graham, right? Yeah. So what we have here is a situation...
Sorry, Dan, I just wanted to...
So what we have here is a situation where compromise has to occur on some level, right? But compromise is not the same thing as change, right? If you're compromising to preserve the status quo, that's not real change, right? It's also, if you have it in, I was at a UFC event in Abu Dhabi, and it was in a sort of a bubble, right? And that bubble was not Abu Dhabi. That bubble was not the Middle East. It wasn't life as it's lived in the Middle East there, right? And we have to remember that the freedoms that are extended to me to drink a beer, not that I drink alcohol, but I can drink a beer in a hotel, but I can't drink one out in the street there, right? But as a white Western man, I'm extended that courtesy. That doesn't exist for people in Abu Dhabi or in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia either. In Qatar, you cannot bring in duty free into Qatar. Doesn't matter if you're a Western or you just can't bring it in, right? And there are hotels where you can drink, and there's one liquor store as far as I know, and that's about it. They're the only place you can get it. You can drink at home, you can drink in hotels, and you cannot be drunk in public, right? So that's compromise, but it's compromise to preserve the status quo, right? Change.
England are fucked, aren't they? They're fine.
Okay, and the Germans and the Danes. Nobody drinks more beer than the Danes when they're watching football. If you've ever, it's funny when you do games in Parken. Anybody who's never done a game in Parken, the stadium in Copenhagen, you can see the journalists do it straight away, right? Because we sit in the press box, but the press box is sort of halfway down the stand, and there's a huge tier of people above us, but there's no roof over us, right? So when Denmark scored last year against Russia, and they started, it was against Belgium or Russia, I can't remember, one of the European Championship games. Anyway, every journalist who'd ever covered games before, the first thing they did was close the lid of their laptop, right? And all you had was all the boys who'd never been there before, and the next thing, the Carlsberg is in their computers, lads, and that's their night's work done, because it comes in an ocean, because they just throw the beers up in the air, and that's it, Now, these people are going over there, and this is the thing, is that going to change, right? Is the situation for gay people going to change? And let's remember that men's football is also extremely homophobic, to the extent where we have 1 or 2 out players. We've had one lad who played for Leeds, the American lad. There's one fella who they were talking about the last couple of weeks. Fair play to him for coming out, but he's playing for some backwater team above in Scotland, right? We don't have players in the Premier League until they have come. Thomas Hitzelsberger from Aston Villa at the end of was Aston Villa, West Ham. Anyway,
Aston Villa,
at the end of when he retired, he came out as being gay there. Women's football is the exact opposite. You could not have a women's football World Cup in Qatar, because my conservative estimate, maybe half the women might be gay, and also they don't want it because it's women, right? Yeah. These are the things we need to work on, right? We have to remember, as we sit here tonight, lads, there are protests going on in Iran because of the lack of freedom for women, because a Kurdish woman was beaten to death last week by the morality police, not because she wasn't wearing a hijab, but because she was wearing it wrong. And also because she's Kurdish, right?
I couldn't believe that there was an actual police force called the Morality Police.
It's
first I heard of it.
It's existed since 1979, I think. And I mean, where I live now, I've both Kurdish and Iranian neighbors living all around me here. And these are people who would have fled from that regime. And it's to see that, and to see women in public cutting their hair. Women aren't allowed to show their hair in public, not allowed to dance in public. I think there's things about them playing music in public, all sorts of things that didn't exist before, the Shah was toppled in 79, right? And these are the things if we're talking about football as being this great power for good, in much the same way as the Live Golf Tour, you know, if I hear your man Graham McDickhead talking about, golf's a great force for good, it's not. It's fucking, you know, takes up a lot of space where an apartment should be, lads, you know.
The sport of golf.
Yeah, the sport of golf has done great things for the world. Yeah, and I hear a certain Danny Murray from that podcast, What's the Story? I believe he's playing that again. We'll get to that. I think he thinks he's going to get an offer of several million from Saudi Arabia, you know. But this is the thing, that if we believe that these things are a force for good, that can't stop after the World Cup is over, right?
Should FIFA, the World Cup, the Olympic councils, you know, are these not conditions of hosting the competitions? Are these not the Olympic legacies? Are these not the FIFA World Cup legacies?
Okay, this is the crux of it. Sorry, Phil. I was just going to say this is the crux of it as well, right? Because what you've got is this. So the WWE thing, right? You mentioned they've signed a 10-year deal with it, right? You look at other sport and franchise. You look at other sport things. Formula One, right? Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia, Grand Prix in Qatar, right? They've signed up to long-term contracts with these places. Do you know what I mean? And it's not like it's not because motorsport is extremely popular in those countries, but because they have global eyes, they're bringing that audience from across the world into it, and people start to look at it and go, oh, maybe it's not so bad over there. Maybe it's not. When the reality is, you know, female spectators, you know, questionable. You've got a situation there. And again, like that, it's took the likes of Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen to a certain extent, kind of saying, am I comfortable with coming here? Not particularly. Like, ultimately, that's what caused the Russian Grand Prix to get cancelled. It wasn't Stefano Domenicali. It wasn't Ross Brawn. It wasn't Chase Carey. It wasn't the guys at the top of the Formula One food chain. It was the drivers who said, that's OG Grand Prix. We're not fucking going. So it's... Can
either of you see this happen at the World Cup in Mexico, US and Canada, where people might say, oh, I'm against US foreign policy over the last 40, 50 years. I'm not going.
I can't.
Is it a false equivalence? Is it a false equivalence?
No. Yes and no, right? There's two complicated things. There's just two things I want to mention first, right? One is I have a good friend, Maria Majd, who's an Iranian female photographer. And recently, only very recently, for very select games, are women allowed to attend as spectators. But Mariam still isn't allowed to be accredited as a photographer for a men's football match in Iran, right? And it fucking, you know, it just fries my head that she's not allowed to do that because she's brilliant. And she wants to go to the World Cup in Qatar, and she's struggling with the same thing because she's coming from an Islamic country. And they go, what a woman photographer from Iran? No, we're not going to do that, right? What you were saying there, Graham, is I think it's absolutely valid to raise those things, right? You can look at it through the prism and say, look, well, hang on a second. This is a country like the USA has engineered coups all over the world, in Venezuela and like Cuba, all these kinds of places, right? Mexico, and the way the cartels have been running the show there for a while, et cetera, et cetera. Just the way that, you know, this sort of, you know, it's almost like a cartel in itself, isn't it? When you see how much American money can influence things around the globe, it's absolutely valid. Is it a false equivalence? We're comparing apples and oranges a little bit here, all right, you know, but at the same time, like if you go back to the 1980s there, you had at one stage, I think there was an Olympics that was in Russia, and then you had the following Olympics was in LA, and the Americans boycotted one, and the Russians boycotted the next one, and that kind of thing. So these things have always been very, very political. But again, the point of the whole thing is to zoom out even further, right? The problem that we face as individuals living in democracies, and indeed people living in dictatorships, is that everything in this world that's worth having has been bought, right? Every government has been bought. Every sport has been bought. Every industry has been bought, including entertainment, et cetera, right? And we need to be cognizant of that in everything that we watch, right? If you take the movie Black Hawk Down, do you remember that movie? It was an absolutely brilliant book if you read it, about like what was a disastrous American military operation in Somalia when a couple of Black Hawk helicopters were shot down, which were believed to be invincible at the time. And it was one of the biggest American military defeats, if you like, in inverted commas, that had ever happened in Africa. And during the editing of that movie, 9/11 happened, right? And I remember speaking to somebody who was very involved in it, and they said that overnight, that became a different film, because the story that you would have told pre 9/11 was absolutely not of American military failure, could not be told afterwards, right? So this is what I mean when I say that entertainment is bought, right? You're not going to do these things. Disney are doing things, you know, with a Black Mermaid and the Little Mermaid, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we're at the point now where people are worried about what the top half of a mermaid, what color she is. It's unbelievable, you know? And when we when we see the world through those eyes, right? I have a very hard time watching international football, but certainly club football. I have a hard time watching it, right? When the Champions League is back next week, we're looking at something that was built on the money of Gazprom, which essentially is, there's the energy crisis that we're in at the moment. They play a rather large part in it, and our dependence on them that has happened over the 20, 30 years. They've been sponsoring the Champions League and how they've sort of, endeared themselves to us. We all know what the logo looks like, right? It's bought. Football is bought, lads. The players are bought. And this is why it's so difficult to speak out, because once you do that, right? If you go back to the man who took football to court to get freedom of movement for players, Jean-Marc Bosman, a journeyman Belgian footballer trying to change clubs in France, right? But once your contract was over, the club still owned you until you were sold. And Bosman took people to court for that. He wasn't the one who made the money out of it, right? Holland was the guy who'll probably end up making the money out of it. All the boys who've gone on free transfers, where the transfer fees now go into the pockets of the agents of the players, they're the ones who make money out of it, right? So all of these things, and it's not just World Cups, and it's not just the Olympics, and it's not just whatever sporting event that you're looking at on your TV. It's housing. It's the drugs that you get for the illnesses that you have or that you need to keep you alive. It's the car that you drive. It's the fuel that goes into it. And we really need to understand that that's the level, that it's in absolutely every facet of our existence. And this is why it can be so misleading to say that it's the responsibility of an athlete. One athlete is not going to change anything. One team boycotting the World Cup is not going to change anything. Sebastian Samuelsson doesn't go to the Beijing Olympics. The next Swedish fucking biathlete gets a chance, going to hop in there, right? If Denmark decide they're not going to go, whatever team didn't make it, Bosnia might say, okay, yeah, well, we've got their place. That's great. They're going to go, right? That's not where the change has to happen. The power to change these things is with us and with our remote controls and with our Visa cards and our MasterCards, right? Because the moment we switch these things off, they're not worth anything anymore. And the moment we stop waving our Visa card or a MasterCard at McDonald's for a case of Budweiser or for, a Ford Kia or whoever, a Ford Kia, that's two makes a car there. But for a brand of car that we go, I'm not buying that. I'm not buying that because they were there and they supported this thing in Qatar or in Russia or in China. And the moment we do that collectively, as millions, if not billions of people, is the time that things start to change. But be very aware as well that they know that too. And any sense of solidarity is quickly squashed when it comes down to why people go, so they're all at it. The politicians are all the same. Actually, the World Cup, the Olympics, all the same. I just got to sit down and watch it. And that's where we fall down because we can't stick together long enough to put these things right again. So,
right, to shift gear a little bit, but still focus on issues of morality in a way.
Yeah.
Right? And Mero, you're probably going to switch off for a little bit here, right? The two stories in the last week from the NBA that have caught me, I feel, right? Boston Celtics coach being suspended for a year, and it's the Phoenix Suns owner, and the controversy around that, right? So how they're being dealt with, right? So for those who don't know, Boston Celtics reached playoff final last year. They were beaten by the Golden State Warriors. Coach, whose name is after completely leaving
Ime Udoka.
Thanking you. Had an affair with a member of staff, with a female member of staff, and is being suspended for a season. Right. So, does this happen elsewhere in sport, or does the NBA become this kind of moral ground? We've seen it during the pandemic. We've seen it in how they've kind of supported Black Lives Matter. They've cancelled games off the back of it. Remember, the Milwaukee Bucks cancelled a couple of games because there was a guy shot and all that kind of stuff. Like, the NBA seems to do things quite well when it comes to this morality thing. Is it, or is it just riding a wave of populism and trying to wag the finger a bit?
I think the NBA is definitely at the forefront of this, Danny. And the reason that the NBA is at the forefront of this is because they've been doing it for so long, right? So back in the day, right? I mean, one of my favorite subjects to talk about is, the history of boxing and the history of NBA, right? And these are two absolutely, decisive things in American culture and American history, right? Because the NBA was somewhere where, basketball is essentially a street game, right? Yeah. It's a playground game. It's a cheap game to play. All you need is a ball and 9 other blokes. And if you don't have them, you can play 1-on-1, you can play 2-on-2, right? You just need a hoop. You can, orange box up outside your gaff, right? So white kids from, the poorest, dirt poor parts of Indiana, like Larry Bird, could play the game. But so could black kids from, the suburbs of New York and from San Francisco and from Los Angeles and from, Compton, all these places. And very, very quickly, it became a game where black people could make make money, right? But in the 50s and 60s, there was an unwritten rule, right, among the NBA owners at the time that you could only have one black player on each team, right? Now, the Boston Celtics go hand in hand with this, right? Because they were the first team to have an all-black starting five in the NBA, right? They were the first team to hire a black head coach in Bill Russell. Bill Russell suffered the most egregious racism you will ever hear about in American history. He was brought to the Boston Celtics, right? An absolutely brilliant player, tremendous defender, changed the way the game is played entirely, both on offense and defense, right? Somebody broke into his house, stole his medals and his trophies, and they shat in his bed, right? Because white people in Boston did not want a black man who was seen as being uppity, because Bill Russell never apologized to anybody for saying, I am your equal, right? Bill Russell and his teammates went into a diner. Now, I think it was in Kansas, but it could have been Kentucky, one of the K places, right? And they said, we don't serve
one of the K places.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one of the K places. How surprising is that, you know? Yeah. And they went in and they said, we're not serving the colored players in here. We don't serve colored players in here. And Bill Russell got on a plane with 3 other players or 4 other players, and they just went home, right? Now, you had Bob Cousy, who was a white guy who went to college in the Massachusetts area and everything, real sort of, all-American hero, that kind of thing. Bob Cousy never understood why Russell was doing what he was doing. But Russell was the one who changed all of this, who made it okay to be a black man in the NBA and to say what you thought about the way that you were being treated, not just by the NBA and not just by the Boston Celtics, but by all of American society, right? He was with Muhammad Ali at the famous press conference where Muhammad Ali was going nuts about, the way he was being treated after coming back from the Rome Olympics and so on, and how he was being sort of singled out. So Russell was an absolute, to me, he's not just the greatest basketball player of all time. Forget LeBron James, Michael Jordan. He's actually the greatest American of all times. Right, because with the limited power that he had, and he only passed away recently, he had the strongest voice you could possibly have. And every NBA team is going to play with a number 6 in their jersey in honor of him now because he's passed away. But what happened with the Celtics there was Ime Udoka had what the club has called a consensual sexual relationship with a member of staff, right? And then the member of staff said that the person in question, that she had been receiving unwanted messages. I'm assuming it's a she, had been receiving unwanted or unsolicited messages from Ime, right? So somewhere in there, and the club has been very tight-lipped about it because legally they have to be, right? Now, what's happening here is that Ime Udoka will probably never sit on the bench for the Celtics again, right? If you ask me, his career is over, but there are legal hurdles to be gotten over. They've done an investigation through a legal firm and they decided that this is serious enough that he has to sit down for a year. We have to suspend him for a year. I don't think there's anything, they would have to be very convinced that what he did was so serious and so egregious that he's not going to come back. But to be seen to be doing this, and this is the Boston Celtics, this is the club that was called out for a decade or more by Bill Russell for tolerating racism in the Boston Garden and in the city of Boston and in the state of Massachusetts. They have to be careful around these things, right? The Phoenix Suns owner was found over the period of about a decade to be dropping racist messages, saying racist things and sexist things, right?
Stories about him are insane.
It's just wild, the things that people are saying. And yet, we shouldn't be surprised because these things happen. This is who these people are, but the NBA is doing the right thing in removing them from the game, because the NBA is also very aware that you have the WNBA, where again, there's a lot of gay athletes. There's a lot of black athletes. You have Brittany Griner, who's sitting in prison in Moscow now for having cannabis oil going into there. And there's great efforts being made. She's become a sort of a figurehead for everything that's going wrong in Russia and the Russo-American relationships there. But they have no choice but to take the moral high ground because the players demand it of them, right? But Danny, if only one player, if only LeBron James was doing this, it wouldn't happen, right? But everybody's behind it.
It's a kip. America is a kip.
But it's the people like this. It's the people like LeBron James, to the extent that he does it, because he's also very wary of the fact that, he has a lot of money coming in from Nike. And as Michael Jordan said, Republicans buy sneakers too. But the likes of Jaylen Brown, who plays for the Celtics, is a very intelligent young man, went on marches to Georgia to protest against police violence, etc., etc. You have a sense of solidarity and a sense of unity there. And that is an example of what I was mentioning last time out. That sense of solidarity can change things, because not only do they do that as a player's body and as a player's unit, the fans back them, right? Everybody in the UFC goes, oh, you got to keep politics over, man. Politics has nothing to, politics has everything to do with sport. You literally couldn't get a credit card between sport and politics, because that's the way it's been since the fucking dawn of time, right? It's been about competition. It's been about my village is better than your village, right? But it's in finding those things and finding that voice. And this is why it's so easy to love the NBA, because the NBA is the America that I want to experience. The NBA is to me, it's the best of America. As I said, Bill Russell to me is the greatest American of all time, bar fucking none, because of what he did and the things that he taught me. A white bloke who grew up in the north side of Dublin and has lived his life on the road. What he taught me, things that I could never possibly have imagined by watching him play and by reading the things that he said and how he conducted his life. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for the Los Angeles Lakers, he's become a brilliant writer. His Substack is wonderful as well. There's so much of the Black American experience. So those of us who grew up watching cowboy films and that kind of thing, we just couldn't have understood it without these people. And that's only a fraction of what there is to know, but it's also a symbol of what is possible when we all get together and we all strive for the one thing, which in this sense is equality in every sense, both racial, sexual, in terms of justice, social justice, all of those things. The NBA is miles, streets ahead of Formula One and everybody else.
Yeah. It's mad, and it's the speed at which it was dealt with that got me. Like I'm very much like, you know, a casual NBA fan in terms of like following and everything else, especially in the off season. But the speed at which these stories sort of came and the speed at which they were dealt with, and you had Adam Silver out doing press conferences and saying his bit and everything else, that it wasn't allowed to rumble on. It wasn't allowed to become a kind of a dirty conversation that, you know, the media had to kind of pile the pressure on and everything else. It came out, it was dealt with, and people are talking about the aftermath straight away. Like,
well, I think that's absolutely essential as well, because it's sometimes there's a school of thought in PR, as you'll well know, Danny, right? If you just keep your fucking mouth shut, it'll eventually go away, right? I remember years ago when I was working for Reuters internally, and a story, I can't even remember what the story was, right? But the same day the story broke, and it made the headlines here in Sweden and everything, you know, Reuters had done something wrong. I don't know if we got a story wrong or what it was on the front page of you know, every newspaper's website, if you can have a front page on that. And then it was the same day that Freddie Ljungberg, who used to play for Arsenal, and Olof Mellberg, the Aston Villa centre-back, they had a punch-up, right? And that went straight onto the top. And the Reuters thing just fell off the front pages straight away. This bust-up between two of Sweden's best players at the time just wiped it off. And that was a case where if you just shut up and say nothing, eventually something else will take over, right? You know, it's like they say on Twitter, every day there's some guy who's the story on Twitter. And the objective when you get up every morning is don't fucking be that guy, right?
Yeah.
And the NBA works like that as well. But they know that if you don't say anything, if you don't act, and if you don't act in the way that the players and the fans expect you to, there will be repercussions, right? So you would have a situation where you'd get Suns fans, and I was over there when this was happening. I was actually with Jose Youngs of MMAfighting.com. He's a big Suns fan. He goes to the games and that kind of thing. He's actually a Celtics fan, but because he lives in Arizona, he goes to see the games, you know? And he was saying you get people tearing up season tickets, people won't buy merch, people won't renew their league pass, they won't watch on the TV, they'll start getting onto advertisers, because that sport has an activist culture, right? People do get out, they do march, they do get involved in corporate social responsibility and those kind of things as well. Now, if you had the same thing in soccer, right? You know, the way the Americans would call it, we don't have that sense of solidarity. We're extremely passive to the extent where Abu Dhabi can come in and buy Manchester City. You know, Abramovich could come in and buy Chelsea. Saudi Arabia could go in and buy Newcastle. And essentially what you get is, you know, 24 hours of a bit of a storm and then a shrug of the shoulders, and Alexander Isak is playing for Newcastle, you know. So they did, like, you know, the NBA doesn't accept that anymore. And I think in part it's the players realizing the power that they have, but it's also that insight that one individual can't do these things. You know, I was up at the airport. You'll love this, Dan. I was up at the airport recently. Where was I going? I was going to Norway before the women's Euros because I was doing a bunch of stuff with the girls during the day there. And I met Enes Kanter, the Turkish basketball player, now known as Enes Freedom. And I was just chatting with him briefly. He was leaving. He'd been over here to collect some prize or something, and he was leaving. And he spoke out about the way the NBA is dealing with China, right? Because it's very, very quiet on the Chinese issue, right? And you've had people from the Houston Rockets have spoken out about that situation and been told, shut the fuck up, don't do this. It's a huge market. All of a sudden, you know, Houston Rockets games disappeared off TV there. Cantor spoke out, and now all of a sudden he doesn't have a club. Now, if you ask me, he's probably not at the NBA level anymore. But if you ask him, he's going to go, I spoke out, so I'm being victimized. So there's, you know, the NBA is by no means perfect, but they are certainly an awful lot more proactive in terms of, you know, the sports washing they do is almost for themselves. You know, the things that they get involved in is almost for themselves, and they do brilliant work, but they're also not fools, you know. So the situation with Ime Udoka, again, the club found out about this, as far as I know, in late June or early July, and they did the investigation properly, right? And this is the thing that you might say that they acted really, really quickly, but they've actually known about this for a long time. And I'm surprised that it didn't leak earlier than it did. But when it did leak, they were already at the end of it. They were putting the bow on this particular case. They knew what was after happening, and they knew the action that they had to take. Now, one of the downsides of that was the way that the Celtics communicated this wasn't very clear. And a lot of women in the Celtics organization, some of whom I know, were going, oh, this is the one he was shagging. This is the one he was shagging. People just putting stuff up on Twitter. And the women of the organization had a very, very hard time, and the club didn't do enough quick enough to come out and defend them and to stick up for them and to say, look, stop fucking speculating, because you people don't know, we're not going to be saying, so shut the fuck up, So the gossip, the rumor mill started. And I know that was very painful for a lot of women involved, but if that's, again, and I don't want to sound glib about it, but if that's the worst thing that happens, at least they saw a situation. Because my take on it is that in some way, Ime Udoka is after abusing his position of power in a sexual sense, right? He's after using the position that he had as the head coach of the Celtics to get sexual favors or to continue a sexual relationship that maybe he wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's a fucking awful thing to do. And we need to call those things out. So in doing that, it's a positive thing. It's a shame that there was collateral damage in the reputations of these women. But yeah, there's an awful lot that can be learned from them, lads, in terms of the Olympic committees, FIFA, UEFA, and so on.
Excellent. That has summed that point up very well. Mero, where do you come into this now in terms of Shamrock Rovers and gambling companies on the jersey?
Yeah, I don't know, because I feel like if I say I don't agree with it, but I gamble, which I do, I'm a hypocrite. I gamble €5 a bet here or there. I mean, I don't see a problem with it for a number of reasons. A couple of reasons being that the League of Ireland needs private investment to flourish and to get these spots into Europe. But that doesn't mean I don't disagree with the people that are against it. Do you know, when Rovers played AC Milan and Paddy Power took over Tallaght Stadium the day before, I had a feeling it was going to be a pre-match stunt and it wasn't going to be there for the actual game. But I thought it was tacky. I thought it was stupid. But I mean, I'm not very animated about the topic. I'm afraid to say.
Is that fence you're sitting on comfortable?
Yeah, but do you see where I'm coming from? I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't want to say I'm against it, but I have a Paddy Power account.
No, I understand that. I suppose
I understand why. I understand why people are against it. I understand why people are against. You might remember cigarettes in tobacco Formula industry 1. In Formula One, the alcohol industry in the GAA. I get it. I definitely get it, but I just wouldn't see myself getting too moved by it.
The only reason I'm asking that one is just because, and it's something that Phil mentioned earlier on, and as I said, as he was saying it, I had about 15 questions in my head and I was trying to plot a roadmap to each bit, right? So
he's taking notes on a roll of wallpaper there, Mary.
Yeah.
As that piece around, vote with your money, you know what I mean? So the gambling, I'm just saying, I wouldn't class myself a gambler, but every so often I'll put a bet on for what I say is to keep it interesting, which is probably the worst thing you can do, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you're watching a match on live TV, if you're in the stadium, and you're getting all these fucking gambling things pushed at you, Bet 365 of Ray Winston's head floating on your 55-inch plasma TV, telling you the halftime odds and next goal scorer odds and all that. Bet in game, bet live, bet now, and it's. I suppose none
of those things make me bet, though.
No, but they don't make you bet, right? But what I'm getting at, I suppose, is gambling is a problematic industry, right? I'm not against it. I get what you. When I'm slagging you saying it's that fence you're sitting uncomfortable, I'm probably no better, right?
Yeah.
It's one of them where I'm kind of I just don't think it should have carte blanche the way it kind of does.
Yeah, and look, it's problematic, and that's where I'm uncomfortable with it.
When I see football clubs with it across their jersey and their stadium is littered with, gambling logos and all that kind of stuff, it just makes me raise an eyebrow to it and kind of go, is this is this right? Like, is this what we should be doing? I feel, I don't know if it's similar situation in Sweden. Like, but
I would raise the same eyebrow. I don't agree with it. I'm just not moved by it. Do you know what and I mean that in terms of, say, activism point of view. Like, I'm as I get older, my tolerance for things is getting really low because
you're turned into an angry old man. It happens to all of us.
Yeah, but I'm just not, like, because of my disability and I've been fighting for things all my life and nothing has really changed. I suppose I'm at my tether in that subject where I'm kind of like, like, they're not going to change. There's no political will to change things. So I'm not going to take on another activist role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting
like being vocal on social media. No. I'm just trying to articulate my point of view where I understand, I have empathy for people who perhaps want it banned on the jerseys, on the stadiums. I get all that. But like, at the end of the day, I gamble. So I like a bet. I like €5 bet for a match, you know, as you said, to keep me interested.
Yeah,
I did a thing the other day, lads, right? I got a phone call off this lad. He's a lovely fella. And I know him as an editor, right? And he said, I'm working for this website. Yeah, deadly. He said, listen, would you do a job for me? I said, yeah, no bother. What is it? He says, it's for this website. And he said the name of it, and nothing clicked with me at all. I'd never heard of it, you know? I says, yeah, it's just to interview the Swedish heavyweight boxer, Otto Wallin is his name, right? He boxed against Tyson Fury and he opened a big cut on Fury's eye, went 12 rounds, came out of nowhere. Nobody knew who this bloke was. And, you know, I was actually thinking, fuck it, I meant to ring you, man. So I may as well do this and get a few bob for it, right? But it turns out that the site it was for isn't a sports news website. It's one of these gambling aggregators, right? So they put up the news and then they put on, you can bet on William Hill, or you can bet on 365, or you can bet on Paddy Power, that kind of thing. As a rule, I don't accept payment. Like, you know, I might give a comment to somebody, but I don't usually work for anything that's related to gambling, right? And that's it. The misery that causes, right? We're not the target of a lot of those ads, lads, right? We've all put on, like, I love to sit here. The nights I'm working with the UFC, the numbered cards, the pay-per-view cards, I'll bet on all 12 or 13 fights, right? I'll just pick the winner in every one of them. And now, sometimes it'll be gone after the first fight in the prelims, sometimes it'll be still alive in the co-main event, right? Never won anything. And I'll put €2 on that. And then I may not bet again for another, it could go years. Like, literally, I'll go to Las Vegas. If I've gambled $10 in Las Vegas in 6 or 7 or 8 years of going over there, that would surprise me. Like, I just don't do it. But what I think of, like, I'm thinking of the industry, right? And what it's based upon, right? So the purpose of Paddy Power, or the purpose of whoever's sponsoring Shamrock Rovers, or, you know, 14 or 20 clubs, actually most clubs in the Premier League now would have a betting partner, you know. Their purpose is not to promote sport ultimately. It's to separate, you know, most people, as many people as possible, from as much money as possible. And the people that I really think about in that situation are the people who are problem gamblers, many of whom are wearing the fucking shirt, right? It's a huge problem among footballers. It's a huge problem in the League of Ireland. It's a huge problem in the Premier League. Gambling is a terrible problem. And what bothers me about them is not that they advertise at football. Okay, it's private businesses. It's not legal. Go ahead. But what are you doing for these people who wind up in trouble, right? And I still hear stories to this day from footballers and from athletes. You know, you go back to Paul Merson betting on NFL. He didn't even know the rules of American football back at the time. And this was telephone gambling. He was calling a bookie and placing bets and that kind of thing. That still exists, right? And people who work in the affiliate gambling industry will tell you, because they might get 40% of what the gambler loses, right? And the bookmaker's happy to give that to them, because it's okay, here's another fucking high roller, get him in there. I'll take 60%, you take 40%. And they are, you know, these people are losing money, and the affiliates themselves can earn huge amounts of money on these things. And that's what I object to, right? If you're selling cans of Coke, or if you're selling cans of Miller Lite or Modelo or Guinness or whatever it is like that, and there's a margin on that they're making 10, 20, 50 cents a pop. If you're selling a Heineken for a $5 or whatever, it's probably about fucking 10 quid in Temple Bar by now. There's a margin on it. Gambling is different, right? And as Declan Lynch, the Irish writer who works for the Sunday Independent, will tell you, gambling is the one addiction that you cannot see externally, right? So if you're taking smack, or if you're taking Coke, or if you're drinking too much, or if you're smoking too much weed or whatever, eventually your outward appearance is going to reflect your inner physical state, right? With gambling, that doesn't happen, right? People could go, you know, I've had situations where it's just somebody come to me and say, yeah, I lost 20 grand over the last 4 months. You fucking what? Because you can't see it. Now, they might look a little bit tired because they've been up betting on the NFL and the NBA, which they know fuck all about, but that's the only outward sign of it. Whereas a physical addiction is going to manifest itself in different ways. And that's the problem that I have with gambling. Whereas in most of Scandinavia, in Norway, Finland, and Sweden, you have gambling monopolies, right? Svenska Spel is here. I think the head of security of Svenska Spel is actually a girl from Cork, as far as I know. In Norway, you have Norsk Tipping, and in Finland, they're called PAF, right? And they do these pools, coupons, and there is gambling there, but it's very seldom single bets on single outcomes, right? It's mostly, a coupon of pools, or you have to pick 3 winners in a trotting horse race or whatever, right? Very strictly regulated. Now, the advent of the internet means that you have all these Maltese companies which are sponsoring, TV broadcasts. The broadcasts are now broadcast out of London so that they can attach these betting ads to them. So it's creeping in here as well. But I think Unibet, Unibet, the bookmakers, they've actually been fined by the Norwegian government, I think it might be 1.2 billion euros or something ridiculous like that, because they've broken the rules for gambling in Norway and for Norwegian account holders, right? So it's always been very strict here. Of course, in Sweden, as I've mentioned to you before, all the off licenses here are state owned and there's no fridges. So if you want to buy a can of cider or a can of beer, you have to take it home, stick it in the fridge, or else you're taking it outside, you're sitting on a bench and you're knocking the thing back, right?
Why is there no fridges?
Because they don't want to encourage rapid consumption, right? So, and they're also closed on Sundays. And one of the things about that is, Graham, right, that if you talk to anybody who's been addicted to alcohol in this country, right, so they're usually open. I think the latest they close on a weeknight is 8:00, and then they close at 3:00 on a Saturday, right? And if you talk to any alcoholic, they will say that 7:00 or 8:00, when the local off license closes, that's when they can breathe out, because all of a sudden you can't do it. The strongest thing you can get in the supermarket is 3.5%, right? And if you drink it quick enough, you may be able to get a little bit of a buzz on, but it's hard enough, right? Gambling is not like that. It's there 24 hours a day. And I wish I could say I was convinced that these guys have some sort of goodwill. If they were only taking 10 or 20 or, say €50 a month off each of us, that'd be fine, right? But they're taking our €50 a month plus fucking thousands off some sham who's out driving his taxi all day just to get money for another bet. And one of the things that really scared me off, I'll still remember the lad's name. When I moved to Sweden, I lived out by the Arlanda airport here, and there was a guy called Sabah, this Iraqi man, who used to do what they call a black taxi, right? So you'd be in one of the pubs, and Sabah would be standing there playing this, on the slot machines. They have poker machines, owned by Svenska Spel, owned by the monopoly, and you'd be standing there playing away, and you say, "Oh, Sabah, we're going to another pub, we'll give you a tenner to drive us there, grand," and he'd be straight back and the money would go straight in there. And I remember everybody in this country gets paid on the 25th, and one night he was in the pub, so I was watching a Champions League game, it was a Wednesday, and by the time the Champions League game was over, he'd lost his entire month's wages on those fucking machines, right? Now, that's to the state monopoly that's supposed to be there to protect him, right? This is the problem I have. There are certain things that we have to regulate so much harder because of the misery. I mean, the amount of suicides, the amount of mental health, etc. And it might only be a fraction of the population. But you know what, lads? If I can't open a gambling account, or if I can only bet €50 a month, I might be able to afford more than that. But if that protects you, Mero Merrigan, or if that protects you, Danny Murray, I'm fine with that. I don't see that as any huge impingement on my freedom, because it's simply not that important to me, right? And that's why I think that those things have to be regulated. And if you're going to sponsor a football club, well, then I want to see what you're doing at the side of that to make sure that the people who suffer from gambling addiction, not just the gamblers, but their children, their wives, their employers, what are you doing for those people? Because then I can take you seriously, right? And it's the same thing. Compromise is not necessarily change, right? And that applies as much to the World Cup in Qatar as it does to Paddy Power. And they need to take their responsibility as what we call corporate citizens seriously, no matter where that is in the world.
You articulated that the way I wanted to articulate my answer.
This is why we get Phil on, because we meander around things with we don't have the intelligence to articulate things. And then Phil comes in, he just goes, "Watch this," and he lobs the ball up and fucking hits a home run. And we go, "Exactly, Phil. That's exactly a great fucking point, Phil."
Great, lads, but I agree with you, Phil.
Lads, what I have to say is I listen to this podcast every week without fail, right? Sometimes as soon as it comes out, sometimes it might be a couple of days afterwards, sometimes it might be a weekend, but I listen to every single podcast. And the amount of times I find myself agreeing with you when I'm not there. So look, don't be giving me credit for coming in here. Like, even a stopped clock is right twice a day, lads. And I do my 2 stop clocks and then I go.
And where are you? You obviously listened to last week's podcast about Elizabeth Windsor. Where are you with that?
I find that really difficult because like you, Graham, you were mentioning there that we're getting to the stage where we're angry old men now, and you're, I'm a lot older than you, so I'm an awful lot more angry than you. At least that's the way I sometimes come across on social media. And I'm trying. I don't struggle to do it, but sometimes I struggle to find, the compassion in myself for people, right? And I understand that the United Kingdom to me is the most gaslit nation in the world, right? These are the people who've been told that they're everything, that they're the best at everything, that everything is brilliant, and there's nobody like the Queen. And I have such a vast amount of sympathy for them. And then when a figurehead like the Queen dies, and like there's a visceral loss for so many people. There's a visceral loss for so many people in Ireland as well. We call them Fine Gael. I'm sure you've heard of them. But that loss is keenly felt by so many people. And I was very careful on social media. I really wanted to put the hobnail boots on and put them in there. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to respect their sense of grief at the same time as I'm also trying to lift how she is problematic as a person, problematic as a figurehead. Everything that she stood for is everything I don't stand for, right? She stood for privilege. She stood for, I'm better than you just because of my last name, just because of my magic blood, this line of succession, all the pomp and ceremony that goes around. I absolutely despise it, And if you ask anybody at Reuters here, when they ask me to go and film the royal family here, I'm the last person they ask because I have zero respect for these people, right? And I'll have photographers there go, oh, Your Majesty, can you look at my car? You go, fuck off, you clown, right? So I'm trying to have that compassion for people who genuinely believe this simply because they don't know any better. And the need then to point out that her past and what she has stood for, from the Mau Mau people in Kenya to Bloody Sunday in Derry, is extremely problematic. And we need to find, we've often said that the Irish and the English are two countries divided by a common language, right? And we need to find a way of speaking about these things, of speaking about the hurt that was shared by people in the Asian subcontinent, in Africa, in Jamaica, in places like this. We need them to understand where that comes from. We need them to understand that if we say bad things about their royals when they die, this is why, right? There's many people. Like Janne Andersson, the coach of the Swedish national team, was going on. He did an interview one time and he was talking about, who inspires you in terms of leadership. And he came up, Winston Churchill was the answer. I'm like, Janne, he was one of the greatest fucking racists known to man. Yeah. And Janne was going, what? And I was going, yeah, all that, we will fight them on the beach.
I had the same conversation with Danny a couple of years ago about Churchill. Danny couldn't believe the quotes that Churchill came up with.
Exactly.
About 10 years ago. Danny's like, what?
Yeah, wasn't the version I was taught in college, lads. No, but I read a book.
Because history is written by the victors, right? We had a funny conversation there a little bit earlier on. My 16-year-old, her friend around the corner is studying English, and obviously the kids will come here with questions because my wife teaches English, Swedish, and Spanish, and I'm not too bad at the old English on occasion myself, and of course the kids speak it, right? So the young one was devastated because they'd taken a bunch of English-speaking countries that they're put into little teams and they're going to make presentations about. And of course, my daughter's mate wanted to get Ireland and she didn't. And instead she got India. She's going, what do I know about India? I was going, India's the same as Ireland, except they're brown and there's a lot fucking more of them, right? They were treated equally badly by Churchill. And, the partition is there between India and Pakistan, And, I'd love to see this as an opportunity in the passing of the torch to King Charles, or whatever he is now, that we can start to talk about these things and what the Queen and the King represent to them and what that same signum represents to us. And I think it's going to be a very long and difficult conversation, but I think that's the only way really that we can put this 800 years behind us, that we can put colonialism into perspective, and that we can put a stop to the sort of financial colonialism and the things that we see today, right? To the point where, again, when I say they're the most gaslit nation in the world, I'm not joking, lads. I mean, those poor people have been led to believe the most remarkable things. Boris Johnson talking about the sunlit uplands of Brexit. And, people saw me posting about, I was saying this time next week they'll be eating out of bins, in the UK. And people are going, that's very funny. I go, I'm not fucking joking, right? That's like they're eating out of food banks at the moment. Bins is only around the corner, Food
banks were closed on the day of her funeral.
This is the thing, right? And like a bicycle fucking, what do you call them? The place where you park your bikes. This kind of weird stuff.
But going back to Churchill there briefly.
Yep.
I'm old enough to remember the start of the pandemic when our leader got up in New York and quoted Churchill to try and get us going.
You see, this is the thing, because again, history is written by the victors, right? And what we're left with then is a version of history that forgets so many things, right? The famine in Ireland, the idea that the famine in Ireland was actually the failure of the potato crop. It wasn't. We had loads of other shit. It was just taken and brought to England instead, right? And this is the version of history that finally needs to be told. And the dawn of the internet age is a great thing for those things, lads, because you can actually find a platform. There's a place for everybody to tell their story. Now, not everybody's going to pay attention, but between, the fact that you can put up a website and you can take to social media and tell these stories gives us a great opportunity to bring knowledge to people. And these are the people that you need to listen to. When we've spoken about journalism before, I've always spoken about this idea I have that when I see a story coming out about Russia, for example, about conscripts in Russia, which I was working with last week, people coming across the border into Finland, and we had people being interviewed on camera, and you're saying to them, are you going to go back? There's no fucking way they're going to answer that question. For the same reason that Khamzat Chimaev can't answer the question about Kadyrov, they're not going to say, I'm not coming back. They're on a tourist visa. If a cop overhears them, he'll fuck them back across the border and they'll be in Ukraine in the morning, right? My question is always, whose voice is not being heard? Right. So when you talk about what's happening in Iran, right, when you talk about what's happening to the Kurdish people in Syria, in Iran, and in Iraq, right, why don't we know their story, right? Why don't we understand the civil war that's happening in Eritrea, between Eritrea and Ethiopia? Why don't we understand that that's a result of Italian and British colonialism? Why don't we understand that Somalia has essentially been a basket case for 30 years because of the influence of the British and what they did when they pulled out? It's always when they pull out of these places. The same thing with Belgium and the Congo, right? And that's because the history was always written by the victors. And not only is history written by the victors, lad, it's written with a big fucking bucket of whitewash and a 6-inch brush, right? It's not designed to be brought to the fore again. And that's what gives you the situation where the leader of the Irish Republic can stand up and quote Churchill, who essentially, wasn't he responsible for the Balfour Declaration, the partition of Palestine, all these things? Their mistakes are still here today, right? Now, we just don't realize that because so much whitewash has been painted over these things. And again, I think that if the path to enlightenment and the path to an improved world is solidarity between us as peoples, between us as Irish men and women, Somali men and women, Kurdish men and women, English and British and Welsh and Scottish and Northern Irish men and women, it's through that sense of enlightenment. And that can only come through compassionate conversations like the ones that we try to have every time we get on this podcast. We have to try to extend them. And sometimes that means not, setting fire to the touch paper of the things that you and I and maybe Danny would have said about the death of Elizabeth Windsor, right? It means having that, letting certain things go unsaid, but trying to steer the conversation in a direction of, okay, that was the world that she created. That was the world that she presided over. Can we make it a better one? Can we find a way of making this better together? What were the bad things from her reign that we don't want to repeat?
We really could have done with this sense of maturity when we recorded last week.
Listen, from a man who won't have a toaster in his gaff, I don't know if there's anything I can teach you about anything.
I mean, look, great point blank refuse to have a toaster in the house, lads, and I'm not for turning on that.
I heard he's doing the toast in the air fryer now, Mero.
Yeah, I would be surprised.
I've tried it. I actually did try it. Mixed results.
Really? Have you tried it?
Yeah, it got done on both sides. He doesn't like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Phil, are the Swedish monarch popular?
Exceedingly so, right? But wow. I've always wondered, right, because there's two things that are really popular here is the monarchy and Monty Python, and I don't know how much is just sort of tolerating them because they've been around forever. The Swedes love Monty Python. It's one of the things they love most about the English language is Monty Python sketches. If you go to somebody's summer house here, or indeed if you go to their regular bathroom in their gaff, you'll often find a picture of the king or the king and queen in the jacks, right? And it just strikes me as being one of those things that's like, okay, is this them, as a social democracy putting them in their place, or what is it? So I honestly don't know.
Well, it is the throne room.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing. And and you wonder if it's sort of ironic or what. Now, they're still very much loved, but they don't have the same profile. They don't have the same devotion. They're more tolerated than loved or respected. Now, again, when the Estonia ferry sank, when you had the tsunami in Southeast Asia, then they came out as the head of state. King Harald in Norway is the same. I'm thinking of, the terror attacks, Anders Behring Breivik, the shooting and bombing spree that he went on. Then when they step forward as head of state, I would have just as little time for any sort of monarchy as I would for Elizabeth Windsor or the House of Windsor, right? But they came out and they undeniably have an effect on the people. People have grown up in a monarchy. Undeniably, it has an effect on them when they look to this head of state to get something out of. So in that sense, they do have a value. They do have a merit. But I wouldn't imagine that they are in any way I don't think they're held in as high esteem over there, or in Denmark for that matter. Finland's a republic with a president. No, they don't have that aspect of it. I think they have a healthy distance to the monarchy in the Scandinavian region.
Brilliant. It's and so they should, and ultimately one day, any monarchy, I'm not in favor of any monarchy at all.
Disband all monarchs.
Phil, as always, these conversations that we have with you, they're a whirlwind and they go by very quickly. And I feel as though, there's a million and one things we can continue to talk about, but alas, time is against us. But before we go, the work you do, right, doesn't get enough credit. So the Irish and Sweden podcast, right, is a fascinating listen. And the characters and the people that you speak to, like, first, where do you find them, first and foremost, right? And then just, like, have you got anything coming up that's exciting you, shall we say?
There's a world exclusive, lads, for the What's the Story podcast, and that's coming very, very shortly. Just let me answer Danny's questions first, right? I'm a fucking moron, Dad, right? I should have been doing that fucking podcast at the start of the pandemic. But no, fucking Muggins here, yeah. Oh, do you know what? The pandemic's nearly over. I should do a podcast for everybody sitting at home with fuck all to do, So I came up with the idea anyway, and I said, okay, because like it just struck me as like, this is what I do. I talk to people. People tell me stories, and I hear them, and I reflect them back in that. And community is all I do. Like, I was out playing Gaelic football. I was out with the Stockholm Gales soccer team the other night. Actually scored a diving Harrow Merrow. You would have loved it. It was like Henrik Larsson against Bulgaria in 2004. No video. Disgraceful. Anyway, I've heard it said that was slightly better. That's my inner Donald Trump coming out there now.
But that diving header is the best diving header of all time.
Unbelievable, And basically, my diving header looked like an old man falling. But I mean, in my mind, it looked like, which is essentially what it was, But when I started the podcast, Dan, I really wanted, like, again, community is everything to me, right? It's like in everything I've said to you over the last, hour or 2 hours, over every podcast we've ever said, we come back to this idea of togetherness, and that all we really have is one another, right? And no man is an island, right? It's one of the most famous quotes that's out there, right? We need each other to survive. And I was thinking to myself, right, how can I put something together that we can all benefit from? And when I started to do it, it was just that the first guest on it was the ambassador, because obviously, I'm not going to liken him to the king or the queen of England, right? He's the man who represents us over here. It was a good starting point. But very quickly, you find these different characters. And the world exclusive that I have for you now is that there's a new podcast coming out, probably sometime in the middle of October. The Irish and Sweden thing is great, but it's never going to make any money, right? Because the population here, our Irish population, between 2,500 and 3,500 people, right? Now, about 10% of them listen every week, which is astounding when you have 10% of a community listening to something every week. It's amazing. And the fact is that they actually listen pretty much from beginning to end in the whole thing, which is fantastic. So I'm launching a podcast now in the middle of next month called The Global Gale, right? And it's the same thing for a global audience. And again, it struck me that, I'm going to keep the same conversational tone. And the thinking behind it, lads, and this is going to come out hopefully in a sort of press release. I'm hoping to sort of publicize as much as possible. There's no such thing as an ordinary Irish person at home or abroad, right? Everybody you meet is extraordinary. Everybody has a story to tell, right? When we sit around and talk off air, and we talk about Paul Howard, and we talk about Gary Mackall, and they're just two individuals of fucking thousands that we know, hundreds of whom we share. Pete Carroll. I mean, you could tell stories between these people forever. And that's the idea. And the idea being to sort of hold up a mirror. And some of those stories really deserve to be told, right? One of the first episodes out is going to be with a girl called Sinead Madden from County Mayo that I used to play music with, right? She's the production coordinator for Def Leppard on one of the biggest stadium tours that took place in America this year. And we recorded the podcast in a hotel in Las Vegas, right? And it's astounding. When she tells you what her daily life is like, we're one of the biggest fucking hard rock bands of all time. And the night before, we were backstage watching 90,000 people going bonkers, and her employers are out there in the stage, and the lads come off the stage and go, what do you think of that, Sinead? Was that all right? It's mind-blowing, right? Zach Toohey, who just was playing Australian rules football down there, he's another one I want to get on. I was in touch with Terry Phelan today, who used to play full back for Ireland, left full, played at USA 94, right? there's just, and like when I started planning this podcast, you always think, because I'm sure you've taught yourselves, where are we going to get the guests from? And it's now at the stage, I haven't even launched the fucking thing. And, it's almost as long as Danny's wallpaper list of questions for me that he has there. Right? There's because so many great stories out there. But ultimately what I want to do, lads, is I want to do for the global Irish community what I've done for my own community here in Sweden. I want to have a conversation everywhere. I want to bring them things that they need to know about, like adoption information. Like, what happens if I die abroad? Right? What happens if I want to be buried in Ireland diplomatically? What needs to be done for me to be buried in Dean's Grange or wherever? Not that there's any chance they'll just fucking tip me into the local lake here, but there you go. What happens with those things? What happens if I turn up at the airport without my passport? Right? So those sort of news items with a little bit of information value, and we want to do them. But I want to have a conversation every week with people that you, Danny Murray, sitting in your car in Portlaoise, can feel I'm part of that conversation. I can't say Anne because it's already happened. I wasn't there, but I want to feel like Phil is there asking the questions that I want answers to. And I want to feel like they're telling me something that gives me something, that gives me a sense of warmth, that gives me a sense of belonging, that gives me a sense of togetherness. And I also don't give a fuck if they're first generation Irish like me, or if they're third or fourth or fifth generation. I've been in touch with the Milwaukee Bucks about talking to Pat Connaughton. Pat Connaughton played for the team that won the NBA championship. So I'm going to try to get Pat on. They said he'll do it. It's just a case of when, right? Pat is an Irish passport holder. An Irishman has won the NBA finals, Dan, right? And I'm going to fucking talk to him about it and his sense of Irishness and where that comes from. And some of the stories are similar, but they're never the same. Everybody has a difference. Everybody has a story about how they came to Sweden. Some of them are similar, but they're a little bit different. And if you listen to the last episode of Irish in Sweden there with Morty McCarthy, who used to be the drummer of the Sultans of Ping, played the drums on Where's Me Jumper, the album Casual Sex in the Cinemaplex was absolutely massive in the 90s. And then, he was just done with a tour with the Sultans, and somebody came up to him and said, do you have a truck license? As it happens, he did. And he wound up on one of the first Oasis tours and has been working with merchandising ever since, And this is the thing that, we're that kind of people. I think we're almost unique because I can't imagine doing a global Swede podcast because let's face it, lads, they're neither as handsome nor as exciting as we are, So that's what's coming down the line. And that really is, if you were to say to me, you have to pick one thing and stick with it for the rest of your life, I think I would pick telling the stories of the Irish community and bringing everybody in to the parlour to sit down and listen to them. Because I think that's the best value, the best thing that I can give to any of us is conversations like this one I'm having we're having with you guys now, and also with the people you're going to talk to. Eventually it's going to be biased. It's going to be the things I think about, the things I love to talk about. That's going to happen, right? Yeah. I'm not the be all and end all. I'm not RTE. This is public service broadcasting, but nobody owes me shit for it, right? So I get to choose what I'm doing in very much the same way that you fellas do, in very much the same way that you did, Danny, when you talked about your operation on this podcast on many occasions. In many ways that Graham, when you talk to me about disability on the Airman and Stockholm podcast, which is also coming back, they're the things that I truly believe have value. You can sit there writing all the match reports about, the Premier League and the World Cup that you like. But if we really want to have compassionate conversations, we have to start them and we have to keep them going. And more than anything else, we have to provide a platform for people to tell their stories, because it's only in sharing our stories that we get to know one another and we get to know the true value of the people that we're speaking to and that we're talking with.
Love it. Absolutely love it.
And if I love the name.
Yeah, great fucking name, actually. Yeah. And if that Pat Connaughton podcast comes together, Phil, I'll be fucking gunning to hear how you get on with him, because I'm a massive Connaughton fan. I think he's fucking underappreciated by Bucks fans for the start.
100%.
And just, yeah, okay, you've excited me greatly here for this. Not just the Pat Connaughton end, but that's the cherry on top. But the Global Gale just sounds like it's right up my fucking alley now. It sounds like it's going to be a cracker, man. So, yes, more of it, Phil. More of it.
Deadly.
And the last thing that I would promise you, lads, is that I've actually been, I kind of had to force myself to do this, right? Because yourselves, doing a podcast every week takes a couple of hours to put together and edit and everything else like that. I said, am I really going to do this? Because there's no guarantee. I'm going to be asking people to go to Patreon. I'm going to be asking companies to sponsor. I said, no guarantee this is going to make me any money, but I have to fucking do it. I don't do things for money, right? But I got a few coffee mugs made with the Global Gale logo on it. And when I come home in January, I'll be home in January the 3rd. And one thing that we are all doing this time around, right? And Dan, I don't mind. I'll give you the money for the petrol, right? Come up from Portlaoise because you're getting one, and Graham Merrow American is getting one, because, you have a ring light, which obviously means you're an influencer. So if I give you that coffee mug, I want you to put a big smiley face on and the coffee mug up beside your lovely, beautiful, handsome head. And the same thing for Graham. Take off the Woody hat, please, Graham. And put them out on your social media and help me out and promote it. But I'll definitely get that for you. There he is. Lovely.
We'll have an exchanging of the mugs. We'll have an exchanging of the mugs.
I hope to see you in Stockholm on November 3rd.
Actually, we'll probably try to do a live Irish and Sweden podcast there, and you will be up there with me when we're doing it.
Lovely.
I'll be in Boston, lads. So, yeah. But look, that's all right. Don't worry. That's all right. That's all right. Philip, it has been an absolute pleasure, my man, and you've given me double excitement now. I'm looking forward to January already. But if people do want to follow you and they want to learn more about the Global Gale, our man in Stockholm, Irish and Sweden, and all the other bits and bobs that you put out into the universe, where can they do so?
The best thing to do is follow me on Twitter at Philip O'Connor. The Irish and Sweden, everything goes through the Twitter account at some point, right? There will be separate Instagram accounts, that kind of thing, for the Global Gale and for Irish and Sweden. But follow at Philip O'Connor. Everything will turn up there. If you want to have a listen to Irish and Sweden, I think that it's actually, as you kindly mentioned, Dan, you enjoy it despite the fact that you don't know the people, you don't live here, but you still get a bit of a buzz out of it when you listen to the episodes.
It's just fascinating, man. Just fascinating.
It's good crack, and I think it's a nice little insight into a small community abroad as well. So people want to listen to that in the meantime. But as I say, towards mid-October, towards the end of October, that's when the Global Gale episodes are going to start to come. And the big thing really is, lads, and I'd be really delighted if people could find, me on social media at Philip O'Connor on Twitter, that kind of thing. But the big thing is sharing, right? Because the one thing that drives me mad, I'm sure you'd have this, on a regular basis as well, somebody says to you, oh, I never knew you had a podcast, and my fucking head explodes. It's like, what do you think I've been doing for 20 years? Oh, yeah, I never knew about the Irish and Sweden thing. You go, oh, Jesus. So if you have the chance, if you listen to something and you enjoy it, I always try to share your podcast and Sean Sheehan's and PC, whatever they're doing, because you never know the day nor the hour when somebody goes, oh, fuck, I never realized that. And then they get into it and they get involved in that kind of thing, And like I say, it's nothing to do with money. I don't fucking care. I work on blind boy, but I need to call him brown boy. Blind boys, silent soundness principle. I said, I don't care if people pay for it or not, right? If enough people pay for it, great, we'll keep it going. If not, we'll do it in some smaller form. If you can pay, great. If not, that's not the point. But put it out there for everybody to hear. Money should never be a barrier to enjoying award-winning podcasts like the WTSpod, or indeed the Global Gale when it finally makes it out into the universe.
Fantastic. Mero, if people want to check out what we've put out into the universe previously, where can they do so?
They can go to WTSpod.com, or they can search WTSpod on any podcast provider.
He's reading it again, Dan.
I'm not reading it. I know it off by heart now.
You're looking at the bottom of the screen.
No, I'm not. I was stuttering because I was like, I was nervous. You can search WTSpod on any podcast provider. I use Podcast Republic, but you can get it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, anywhere, everywhere you can get a podcast. I'm at Danjo Murray. Oh, no, I'm not. Stop confusing me, Phil. He's at Danjo Murray on Twitter.
Just read the thing and get it over.
Come on, Phil, you have him rattled.
And that's all for this week. Clear eyes.
Full hearts.
Can't lose.
Good luck.